All right, so today we're going to look at the American Revolution, and the essential question that I want you to think about is, was the American Revolution a political and intellectual event that was defending the ideas and principles, or was it a social and economic phenomena with material interests at heart? The sub-question that I want you to think about is, what are some significant factors for the success of the Patriot win in the American Revolution? So one of the biggest concerns that the Patriots had was mobilization. So how are they going to raise and organize an army? Some of the issues included the supplies. So while they were relying on Britain for most of their supplies, they also were relying on France. Luckily, France would be on their side during the American Revolution, but anything that they had relied on from the British, they're then going to either have to be self-sufficient and create as their own industries, so import substitution, or rely on the French. Financing. Congress was not able to levy taxes, and so the only way to finance the war was to try to sell bonds. Initially, that was the idea. However, very few people could afford this. So then the government decided that they should create paper money. However, that led to inflation. So as a last resort, they will end up borrowing money heavily from France. And this should be a reminder from what was happening in world history with the French Revolution, and one of the reasons that the debt in France was so high leading up to the French Revolution. So who was fighting in this war? So one, you have militiamen, also known as Minutemen, because they were able to prepare for combat at the drop of a hat. You have the Continental Army that will be established by George Washington, and you have between 5,000 and 8,000 Africans who are also fighting in the American Revolution. So to backtrack a little bit as to why these people were fighting, by 1775, you have over 500,000 Africans living in the colonies, most who were enslaved at that point. While the Quakers did question the morality of slavery, mostly in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, most of these concerns were going to largely be ignored. So by 1760, when the colonists are fighting the British, they're going to point out the contradictions of liberty and owning slaves. And that's going to be a problem for the colonists. Because if we're going to fight for liberty and freedom and equality, that would also then mean that that needed to be applied on multiple levels of the social structure. So many slaves wanted to fight as part of a democratic revolution that would offer them freedom. Another group that was going to be mobilized was women. So examples of this, you have Deborah Sampson, who secretly fought as a man. She was found out and discharged. You had camp followers who were following their husbands into the army and dealing with the domestic side of the army, such as washing, cooking, mending clothes. And you get the general figure, such as Molly Pitcher. There is a video that I will link for you that I would like you to watch. It's super quick, but it's about how historians argue, like, who is Molly Pitcher? Is she a person? Is she a myth in history? And kind of this idea of the role of women and why it's so important for the American Revolution. Also, you have Phyllis Wheatley. She was an enslaved woman who wrote revolutionary poetry. She lived in Boston. Important for her, she is the first published female author in America, as well as the first African-American woman to be published. So again, I will link this video. It's very short. It's just a couple minutes about who is Molly Pitcher, do we know who Molly Pitcher is, and how historians view her in history. So, measuring up the colonists versus the British, who appears to have the advantage? So we have the British, who has the greatest navy in the world at this point. They have an equipped army. They have access to multiple resources through all of their colonies and their empire. They have a coherent structure of command, and they have hired German missionaries to help them fight. So the German missionaries or mercenaries were soldiers who were hired to serve in a foreign army. Hiring foreign armies was not unusual in the 18th century, so that was common throughout Europe. Then we have the Americans. They have a brand new army. The only time that they have unified prior to the American Revolution is the 7 Years' War. They have a new government system that they have been creating over time. The advantage, though, is that they are fighting on their own territory and they know their own territory. They are united in their cause, and they do have foreign support from the French. So phase one of the American Revolution, the British are uncertain if this is going to be a full-on war or if this is going to be a small skirmish. So the first event is going to be Bunker Hill, so June 17, 1775. It is also known as Breed's Hill, which is located in Massachusetts. The British troops are attacking the colonists along Bunker Hill. The Americans push back. However, this will end in a British victory, creating a British stronghold in Massachusetts. So casualties, you have about 1,154 British who die and about 331 colonists who die. Despite the fact that there are lower numbers of death for the colonists, it still is a British victory. So on this map, you will see where Bunker Hill is located. So invasion of Canada, December of 1775. So as much as we haven't really talked about Canada, there is a British stronghold and British colonies as well as some French in Canada. So there is an American invasion of Canada. By American, I mean the colonists or the patriots. And they're hoping to remove the British threat from the north. Benedict Arnold is going to lead in these forces, and he should be someone who is familiar to you throughout history. If you have not watched, there was a show, Turn, which really focuses on him and is this idea of to Americans, he's a traitor, and to the British, he's not, or does he just get this raw deal throughout history? So the Quebec campaign basically ends in frustration. Nothing really comes of it. British Evacuation Day. So this is really the turning point for phase one. A lot of the British we already mentioned in Bunker Hill will be in Massachusetts. However, they're realizing that it's not tactically a great idea. It's pretty much tactically indefensible. It's near a land, it's easily isolated, easily besieged. Also, it's the most anti-British center for the colonies. So the British are concluding that it's not ideal for war. By the winter, the Patriots are pretty much surrounding outside of Boston. So March 17th, 1776, the British will leave and go to Halifax, Nova Scotia with a bunch of their Loyalist refugees. So again, this is reflecting a changing assumption of the war by the British. It's not going to be a small skirmish. It is going to be a full-on conflict. So here on this map, in case you are unaware of Canadian geography, this is showing you basically the United States. We have here in the yellow, and then Nova Scotia with Halifax as basically an island of Canada. So after phase one, who appears to be winning the war and why? That is one of the questions that you should be thinking about at this point. So there's a video embed here. I'm sure some of you have seen it in middle school, but if not, I will also link it for you. It's on the Declaration of Independence. It's basically a parody. But the Declaration of Independence will be formally declared July 2nd, 1776. Congress approves the text on July 4th, which is the day that we typically celebrate. But it is not fully signed until August 2nd. So just know that when you're celebrating the 4th of July, you're celebrating Congress approving the text, and that's about it. So the main person who you should be familiar with for writing the Declaration would be Thomas Jefferson. The other key to this is that the Declaration of Independence is the list of grievances and problems that the Americans have, not the actual end of the conflict. So this is colonists saying we are declaring our independence from Great Britain, but they are not in fact actually independent at that point. So where are the Loyalists? Why are Loyalist cities? Why are Loyalists near cities? Why is the backcountry contested? Why were Native populations Loyalists? So if you look at this map, you can basically see you have your Patriot strongholds are these large land masses that are basically going to be kind of your countryside. Loyalist strongholds will be the cities. You want to think about ports, trade, easy access in and out. Also, you want them along the coast for that reason. And then you have Native populations who are both Loyalists, and some of them will support the colonists. And so in this point, you want to think back to the 7 Years' War and who were the natives fighting for and why were the natives fighting that way. So Loyalists were mostly in New York, Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah. When we're talking about the backcountry, we're really talking about the Carolinas. So you want to think about the Regulator movement and why were American Loyalists why were Native populations Loyalists? You think about, again, the 7 Years' War and the Proclamation Line and what the Proclamation Line symbolized for the Native peoples, even if it was a failure. So phase two, this is basically when the British are in the best position to win the war, and it's becoming more of a conventional war. When war becomes traditional, the Americans are woefully undermatched. So that's important to note for phase two of the American Revolution. So the British are able to take New York City in the summer of 1776. The British have about 32,000 soldiers under the command of William Howe. And they are hoping to basically awe the Americans instead of fight them. Like, let's shock them instead of having to fight. So they believe that they are given the choice that most colonists would show the loyalty to the king. Basically, they thought if we challenge the colonists, they truly are loyalists deep down, and so there won't be a need to fight. So Howe is going to provide two choices. One, submission with royal pardon. So if you basically say, yes, I am a loyalist, you will be pardoned. Or two, we're going to fight. The colonists clearly choose to continue the war, even though Washington only has about 19,000 men that were poorly armed and trained and no navy. So woefully unmatched. So the British will push colonists out of Long Island and Manhattan and drive them into New Jersey and Pennsylvania. This is kind of where that big iconic painting of Washington comes from. So for the British, 18th century warfare is seasonal and it stops in cold weather. That's one of the reasons that this battle is going to be so significant. December 25th, 1775 is when this battle occurs. So the other piece is that it's taking place on Christmas. If you remember back into world history, when we look at like World War I, there's a ceasefire over Christmas because it wasn't commonly fought on major religious holidays. So Washington will cross the Delaware River. He will have a surprise attack and occupy the town. He continues into Princeton, New Jersey to drive out the British. However, Washington is not able to hold either and eventually will retreat back into Morristown, New Jersey. So again, the British had settled down for the winter at various points in New Jersey, leaving an outpost of Germans at Trenton on the Delaware River. And so initially this seems like a Washington win, but in fact they will have to retreat. So here is just to show you where Trenton is, New Jersey, where Washington was coming from. So the British will attack Philadelphia in spring of 1777. General Howe will launch an attack and basically occupies Philadelphia with little resistance. There is an assault on Philadelphia, leaving the British troops in the north alone, which is going to be a problem. One of the reasons they did this is there was a hope to discourage the Patriots and end the war by taking Philadelphia. So the Battle of Saratoga was September 19th and October 7th, 1777. So yes, it is two dates because there are going to be two separate crucial battles that take place at Saratoga. So the British want to invade New York from Canada because remember they had fled up into Canada and you also had a stronghold there. So the idea was that they would come down so they could control New York and isolate the New England colonies from the South and end the Revolution. This is a Patriot victory. Most historians argue that the Battle of Saratoga is a turning point. So for example, Edmund Morgan stated, "It was the greatest turning point of the war because it won for Americans the foreign assistance, which was the last element they needed for victory." And that is in Birth of a Republic on page 82 and 83. So this is when the Americans fully get France as part of their alliance. And this is now becoming a global war. France will finance, provide supply and combatants, and it will give colonists enough staying power to outlast the British. Basically, the reason the French is willing to do this is they want to see the British lose part of their empire. So here you see a map of the Battle of Saratoga. So France is recognizing the Americans at this point. Prior to Saratoga, France had not given diplomatic recognition. Benjamin Franklin had even gone over to France to try to gain this. In 1778, the French will officially recognize America as a sovereign nation, saying that they are independent from the British, and again, provide money, munitions, and a navy. Franklin was greatly popular among the French, especially the aristocracy and the common people. But again, this is now making it an international conflict over the next 2 years, where we'll have the French, Spanish, and Netherlands join in a general war against Great Britain.